Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this final session of our conference on the global governance of plastic pollution, transforming the global plastics economy. So welcome back to those of you who've been with us before, and welcome to those for whom this is their first session. So on behalf of UNCTAD and the Graduate Institute's Global Governance Program, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome a great panel of speakers. We've worked to put this conference together with a number of colleagues from different organizations that you have seen listed on the program materials, and we're really delighted to have been able to bring together such a diverse group of speakers over the last 2 days. And for this, we're also grateful to the Swiss Network of International Studies, who provided us financial support for this project. So in this last session today, we're going to focus on transforming the plastics economy through circularity. As we've heard in the last 2 days, there's a lot of hope placed in the concept of circularity and this idea that we can move towards a more circular plastics economy as one of the ways in which we can help reduce plastic pollution. So there are many opportunities there. There are many policy options for a more circular economy. There are also some critical perspectives out there that draw attention to some of the challenges at play and perhaps where the circular economy concept will not take us. So today we wanted to try and unpack some of this and understand a bit better what some of the different perspectives are. So we have 5 speakers. I'm not going to read out all of their bios, but would direct you on our website. We have links to everyone's biographies. But we're going to start first with Patrick SCHRÖDER, who is the Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. And he's been doing some really interesting work there, really taking a leadership role on circular economy issues, in particular with developing country perspectives and challenges. And so I'm going to first start with Patrick. You have the floor.
Oh yes, yeah, great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, I'm Patrick SCHRÖDER. I'm leading the circular economy research at Chatham House. We're looking at the circular economy not just from a plastics perspective, but across a range of different sectors. And we've been trying to understand the circular economy in the international development context, how it can contribute to the SDGs, and looking at cross-cutting issues around finance, trade, and policies. And for today, I've prepared a few slides, which I will try to share here. I hope you can see the slides now. So, yes. Great. Yeah, I'll start with some of the key messages on circular plastics, because I'll leave that to the end. I might run out of time. Some of these things have been mentioned in the sessions by the speakers earlier. But I mean, from our perspective, one key issue is that the circular economy is a lot broader than recycling, and tackling plastics pollution will require more than recycling. And it's also, that was mentioned in the first session, for instance, about a cap on plastics, virgin plastics production. I think, from my perspective, I think that there will be necessary to limit the volumes, just for the reason that if we have cheap supply of virgin plastics, really inhibits or even prevents these other circular economy innovations that we need in material science, but also new technologies or business models around, for instance, reuse or refill for packaging. It also inhibits changes in the way we use and consume plastics products. Then another key message that we also see not only relevant for the circular plastics economy, but for other sectors as well, that redesigning the linear system towards a circular system will have implications on the value chains for industry and trade. That's why we keep emphasizing that the circular economy needs to be inclusive and also needs to follow just transition principles. Again, something that was also mentioned previously. And linked to this, we really see the need for a lot more international collaboration and global development programs to support low and middle income countries in the transition from linear to circular. Then a final point, the third one, is that we currently see a significant financing and investment gap just for basic collection and waste management infrastructures in the global south. And at the same time, there has been an increase in investments for circular plastic solutions and innovations, but these are mainly looking at or taking place in countries of the global north. So that's also an imbalance that I think we need to look at. So some of the following slides are to give some more background to this. So if we look at this map here, we can see the countries in which inadequately managed municipal waste and plastics is a concern. So, I mean, these are relatively old data, and over the last few years, things have improved a little bit, but I think it's still representative of the current situation. So what we've done at Chatham House, and we see with the blue colors, you will see so where really priority action should take place. And what we're doing at Chatham House, this is a policy, circular economy.earth page that we developed end of last year, where we track policies for the circular economy around the world. And it's interactive and can be used as a resource if you're interested in doing policy research. So we've seen many developing countries already very active. So an example here is Kenya, which has recently launched national circular economy policy, but also has product policies and waste management and recycling targets. It's linked also circular economy to the National Appropriate Mitigation Action, the NAMAs. And a lot of this is driven by concerns about plastic pollution. So we see these topics are quite closely linked, and plastics pollution is often the entry point to more systemic approaches to circularity. And so we see on the policy level, countries and governments becoming aware and trying to tackle this. But again, what I mentioned earlier, it's also investments in solutions are still lacking. And there's also this mismatch by, for example, if we look at this map here, this is the new plastics economy global commitment map of the signatories who have joined this great initiative, which has some ambitious targets on recyclable content, etc. But we see that's also, again, mainly focused in the global north, China, Brazil, but for instance, Africa or Southeast Asia are not really the focus of this initiative. And to address this gap, I wanted quickly to introduce a new program in which we are partner. It's funded by the European Union. The title of the program is Switch to Circular Economy Value Chains. And the countries in blue are those which are in scope of receiving funding through this program. And plastics value chains, plastic packaging in particular, is part of this program. So the idea is also to involve multinational companies who are key to making this work. They are invited to demonstrate circular approaches for plastic packaging, in particular working with their suppliers in developing countries. So this is a range of the different activities which can be funded under this program. And it's still in early stages. And what we've been doing over the last few months is engaging with European multinationals, including consumer brands, but also some companies from the petrochemical sector, to develop projects which would then receive funding through this larger program. And so these are a range of the different activities which can be financed. Maybe one reflection on this is that we initially thought the multinationals would be quite enthusiastic about the program. What we've noticed engaging with them, it was actually quite difficult to have these discussions and convince them to take time to put together proposals and then submit those to UNIDO. However, over the last few months, we've engaged, and now we have hopefully a good selection of these projects. The deadline for submission is 15th of September. So I can't talk about any of the details yet, but it promises to be a good program with some interesting pilots, which hopefully can then be replicated and scaled up by others. So there's more information on this available here, and I will post this also in the chat box if you wanted to then follow the links and look at this. There's also a parallel program on circular textiles, which is also under the Switch to Circular Value Chains umbrella. And actually, maybe just reflecting on this, these are quite different value chains, and we've seen that multinational brands are a lot more active in the textiles and garment sector, actually, in comparison to the plastics, which was also interesting for us to observe. And I stop here. I hope it wasn't too long. Happy to answer any questions you have later.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick, and also useful that you highlighted the textiles and garment sector, because, I mean, in fact, from a microplastic point of view, the growth of the synthetic textiles sector is something that is interesting, and I have yet to do the research to look at how much the work on circular economy in that sector is looking at the microplastic issue, but we could come back to that maybe in the break, because that's surely one of the big sort of international supply chains and internationally connected kind of networks as well. So we're going to turn next to Mahesh SUGATHAN and Henrique PACINI. Now Mahesh is a senior policy advisor at the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, and Henrique is the economic affairs officer at UNCTAD. And they have been working in collaboration on issues around the sustainable manufacturing sustainable manufacturing and plastics, and also specifically around non-plastic substitutes, with a focus on developing countries and where there might be economic and trade opportunities for them. So I'm going to turn first to Mahesh, and then he will sort of share the slide with Henrique afterward. Mahesh, you have the floor.
Thank you, Caroline, and good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. So what I'm going to do today is basically make the case for a switch to substitutes for single-use plastics. Now, the central point is that, well, this is not sort of the only solution. I mean, it should be considered as one of a range of solutions to address the problem of single-use plastics. But why look at substitutes? Next slide, please. Right. So essentially, the reason is that we all know that plastic waste management and recycling capacity is lacking in most developing countries. Now, this capacity is going to get built up, but it is going to take a long time. Between the time that the capacity gets built, we need to be doing something to address the waste in single-use plastics, and switching to compostable and environmentally friendly options could be one way of doing that. A second reason is that substituting plastics with environmentally friendly materials, according to a Pew study, could prevent 17% of projected plastic waste generation by 2040. Now, this represents about 71 million metric tons of avoidable macroplastic waste. Thirdly, single-use plastic substitutes rely extensively on domestic feedstocks. Now, when we look at a lot of the feedstocks that could be used to make these compostable substitutes for plastics, they come from agro waste, or they come from natural resources that are usually found in developing countries. This has a potential to generate livelihoods, trade opportunities, economic activity. So it could be seen as a potential win-win situation, a win for the environment, a win for trade, and win for development. Now, the feedstock for these substitutes could either be produced domestically, but even if they are imported, the imported feedstock itself could be an input for manufacturing some of these end-use products. Next slide, please. Now, I just wanted to present some of the findings of a study that we did for UNCTAD under the Sustainable Manufacturing and Environment Program, which my colleague Henrique is going to talk about in his next presentation. Now, this was essentially to sort of look at 3 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So we looked at Nigeria and Kenya in Sub-Saharan Africa and Bangladesh in South Asia, to see what sort of materials could be used to substitute single-use plastics in these countries, and which rely on some of the naturally occurring feedstocks there. Now, the methodology we used for that was firstly to identify some of the problematic single-use plastic categories. We looked at a couple of categories like takeaway containers, grocery bags, plates, straws, bottles, and sachets of water. Why did we look at these specific product categories? Because of the fact that a lot of them come up quite often in the beach litter that's been collected all over the world. So a survey by a number of organizations around the world showed that some of these items were the most frequently found problematic pollutants in beaches around the world. So once we identified these categories, we looked at a range of compostable materials for these categories based on established or potential feedstocks in these countries. The next step was to conduct life cycle assessments for these materials, as well as a techno-economic analysis for potential feedstocks, and look at some of the most promising options. Now, the life cycle assessment was conducted by one of our partners, FLSCI, the Forum for Sustainability and Life Cycle Innovation, based in Berlin. And I'd like to acknowledge their work on the report. So basically, they looked at it in a twofold way. They looked at sort of the macro life cycle assessments that has already been conducted by other organizations, particularly UNEP. And secondly, they looked at a number of country-specific screening life cycle assessments, which really looked at some of the localized factors prevailing in these countries, such as the waste management scenario, the kind of the waste management facilities that are there, the feedstocks available, environmental problems, etc. So sort of very localized and very specific. And finally, we looked at, once we identified these options, we looked at, well, what sort of trade opportunities might also exist for some of these options. Now, the figure on the left basically compares the impact for a number of materials for a grocery bag in Bangladesh. So we looked at corn fiber, cotton, jute, and paper. So essentially sort of looking at a range of environmental impacts like global warming, ozone depletion, water pollution, marine ecotoxicity, etc. To summarize it, essentially what we find is that the environmental impacts vary quite a bit between a lot of these different substitutes. And there's a lot of trade-offs that are involved. So for example, plastics might actually fare a lot better in terms of impacts like energy use and water use. But on the other hand, when we consider pollution of water bodies and soil, etc., then some of these materials actually are much better. That said, the disposal of these materials also matters. So even if some of these materials are compostable, if they're not composted off or sort of treated in a proper way, they could sort of lead to methane and other sort of emissions and other environmental problems too. But one of the big drawbacks of a lot of these life cycle assessments is that they really don't take into account the microplastic pollution and some of the soil pollution that come from single-use plastics. The techno-economic analysis, I think the main conclusion is that single-use plastics really are relatively a lot cheaper compared to a number of materials that we looked at. So the price is a big challenge which will need to be overcome. And of course, a lot of factors drive those low prices, including fossil fuel subsidies. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at the trade opportunities for some of these materials, in Bangladesh, for example, what we find is that Bangladesh, we look at the sort of the trade balance in both plastic and non-plastic substitutes, as well as feedstocks for both feedstocks and end-use products. So for natural fibers like jute and sisal, Bangladesh is a net exporter, and it has some smaller net export values in cereal, straw, and husks. Top export markets for a lot of these products included both developed and developing countries. South-South trade is also fairly important. So Bangladesh actually exported to markets like Côte d'Ivoire in Africa, which imported jute for packaging some of their commodities like cocoa and coffee beans, for example. There are also potential exports for jute, for aluminum waste and scrap, vegetable plating materials, paper, cardboard, etc. Now, Bangladesh is also a net importer of some of these non-plastic end-use products, particularly jute bags, cotton bags, and so on. The markets included both developed and developing country markets. The other interesting thing is there's also a lot of regional trade happening. So Bangladesh also exports to other South Asian countries, particularly India, which comes out as a big export market for aluminum bottles and jute bags. Then we also looked at a reveal comparative advantage analysis for some of these these products for Bangladesh. And one of the findings is that for jute and sisal, Bangladesh seems to have a revealed comparative advantage for these exports. In terms of market access, Bangladesh also benefits from a lot of the GSP schemes, generalized system of preference schemes, which grant preferential access of exports to a lot of developed country markets. And there are many developing countries as well, such as China and Korea, which provide this sort of access. Bangladesh also enjoys preferential access to the South Asian market under SAFTA, or South Asian Free Trade Agreement. However, there's a lot of scope for further reduction of duties on natural fibers, jute, and jute products, particularly among the larger developing countries. So there's a lot of scope for further expanding market access for these products in other developing countries. And in addition to tariffs, non-tariff barriers might emerge as even more important. So there are a lot of non-tariff barriers that prevail for natural fibers, such as fumigation requirements and so on. And these will also need to be addressed. Next slide, please.
Mahesh, we're going to have to ask you to wrap up because we've only we're over time.
Yes.
Thanks.
Well, this is my final slide. So essentially, sort of the takeaway is that trade can play a key role in expanding market access and in promoting plastic substitutes. So there are a range of options that countries can adopt at the national level. So this includes industrial policy, financing policy, building opportunities for plastics exports, attracting investment into non-plastic substitutes, as well as introducing retail systems and distribution systems that don't use plastics, and including systems that are reused based on reuse and refill. Now, where can trade play a role? Trade could play a role by basically expanding markets to a lot of these products by reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers. There could also be international cooperation to facilitate foreign investment. And it might be important to also look at the space that is available for countries to actually develop some of these non-plastic substitutes within the realm of industrial policy. And the last column in the figure basically shows which forums might be the best avenues for pursuing some of these options. And we list a number of them like WTO, UNCTAD, OECD, UNEP. So all of these organizations would have to play different roles. The concluding point would be that trade measures should not be looked at in isolation. They would be definitely more effective when looked at in a holistic manner. So in addition to trade measures, we also need to look at a range of the other enabling factors, such as addressing fossil fuel subsidies to upstream in the upstream plastic sector, introducing effective reuse and take back schemes, investing in end-of-life options, etc. So really looking at a range of options in which trade will play an important part, but not the only part. Thank you, and I'll hand it over now to Henrique.
Mahesh, thank you for the organizers for inviting UNCTAD to be in this event. If you can shift to the next slide, please. So complementing what Mahesh just said, and by the way, the Granite Institute and the Global Governance Center, where Mahesh and Carolyn are doing a great job helping us to conceptualize and identify better which are the trade-offs, which are the products, which are the feedstocks that have perhaps a better competitive chance in markets in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But this is it's really important, because given the scope of potential actions, it can be overwhelming, basically. But this type of analysis, in-depth analysis, including LCA, helps us narrow down the focus. For example, you can see in Bangladesh, the jute is a very interesting product, and in other alternatives to plastics in Bangladesh are much more dependent on imports. So the country actually don't have yet the productive capacity to do it competitively. So, but complementing that, I mean, one thing is it's a large macro top-down discussion which is happening among multilateral organizations, the countries, groups, for example, WTO, IDP group, harmonization and upgrade of the HS codes for plastics at a very high level in order to harmonize rules for different countries and how to tackle this problem. So, but this has to be complemented by a bottom-up, let's say, supporting the champions on the ground, especially in developing countries where you have a high growth, especially expected growth in the future, and you don't want plastics to be adopted in the same way. So this connection between the synapses, so the top-down and the bottom-up work is important, and we've been contributing to the fight against plastic pollution through the SMEP program funded by the UK, doing some on-the-ground support to some solutions. Okay, I will describe this briefly. It's similar to what Chatham House is doing in the UNIDO switch, by the way, which we are happy to be in touch with and trying to align efforts with them. We have a very big interest on the SMAP program, which is a Sustainable Manufacturing Environmental Pollution Program, to act on the sources. The UN Environment Assembly process has reflected this general interest to go for the sources of the problems and not only to the cumulative plastics accumulated in the environment. And the SMAP targets the manufacturing sector, which is one of the origins of the design of the problem we have now. If you could shift the slide, please. So I'll just give you some insights, because recently we had a call for proposals for work on plastics in 10 sub-Saharan African countries and 3 South Asian countries as part of this SMEP program. And this call was open for about 2 months and received a number of applications ranging from areas of biodegradability, alternatives to plastics, like Mahesh well described, and also improved manufacturing and remanufacturing solutions. So there were 3 options being considered for funding under SMAP. And I'll give you some highlights of what we received. Why is this important? Because this gives a taste of the bottom-up demand. There's a lot of demand for trialing, for developing concepts, for maturing products that will address this problem at the ground, at the countries. If you can shift to the next animation. Yeah, so we got 104 concepts in our open call for proposals on plastics. 104 concepts received out of 243 registrations of interest. So there is plenty of interest in the market among companies, research organizations, academia to do work on this. And we have received a total of 93 million pounds, over $100 million in requests for funding. Of course, we can only fund a fraction of that, but that just shows that the demand, the bottom-up demand, is very high in developing countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, and most of the applications we received are indeed lower technological readiness level. So our research concepts were at the pilot stage. They're not so much at a more near market phase. But of course, this is expected now, given a lot of the alternative products are still small scale and their production lines are still developing. Next slide. Out of the proposals received, and this, of course, in an anonymous way, but it gives you a sense of category. Most of the proposals came in the categories of material development and material substitution, similar to Mahesh's presentation. and improved manufacturing and remanufacturing solutions. We had a lower market appetite for accelerated biodegradation to tackle the plastics problems in Africa and Asia. Next slide. And most of the applicants, interestingly, the lead applicants were from the private sector. So there is private traction on this. There are, I was personally expecting more from research and academia, but I was heavily surprised because the private sector seemed to be very keen on, of course, through consortia and grouping with others, to lead applications to develop alternatives. Next slide. So finally, and it's nice to have Chatham House here on board as well, representing perhaps the Switch consortia and the TESS. It's very important for us to align efforts, because there are many ongoing initiatives through NIDO, through UNDP on the ground, the World Economic Forum also in Geneva, the Alliance to End Plastics Waste, also represented in Geneva by WBCSD as a partner. So it's important for us to keep those constant dialogues in order to keep in mind the importance of connecting the synapses, this discourse that tries to harmonize rules at the macro level and supporting interesting options at a more micro level, especially involving the private sector, who would be really the transformator on the long run. We also need to pay attention to rebalancing of subsidies. And by the way, the study that Mahesh referred to will be published very soon, looking at alternatives to plastic material and trade policy related to that. There will be a whole discourse and reasoning on the problems of subsidies to plastics. The tariffs question, some countries still have significant tariffs on alternatives vis-a-vis plastics, and NTMs. And finally, this will lead into a technical assistance thread from next year onwards, where we expect to cooperate with other organizations that are working on plastics in Africa and Asia. To be all from my side. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to Mahesh and to Henrique. It's fantastic to see all of that research put together, Mahesh, on the substitute side. And also Henrique, I think really, I mean, this is something that people, I'm sure many people will be interested to see just what the demand is there. I mean, as you mentioned, this $93 million figure for investment, I mean, there's really a lot of, and the fact that there are concrete projects ready to be pursued and investigated further, and the interest of the private sector, really, really interesting to ground some of this discussion that we're having. So I'm now going to turn, because I don't want to take up space, from Rosalind and Kimberley. So Rosalind, you now have the floor. Rosalind is the director of the Governing Plastics Network based at the University of Surrey. Rosalind, you have the floor. You need to take you off mute as well.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my slides. No, I think I'm not doing the right.
No, it's up. Thank you.
Yeah, you can see my slides? Good.
Yes.
Excellent. I'm not quite sure how to move them on, but
just click on the screen or use your arrows.
Sorry, I'm just having a bit of a battle here. Okay, I've got it now. Thank you very much, Carolyn, for the introduction. I am indeed speaking from the Governing Plastics Network, and I'm going to speak particularly about one of our projects, that's the wicked problem of plastic and the discourse surrounding its governance. We have several projects running as part of the network, and this is one of them. And this one is run in conjunction with the University of Nairobi. And in fact, you heard from my co-director yesterday, Professor Nicholas Oguge, who spoke about the perspective from the African continent in general. And he and I collaborate as co-directors for the Governing Plastics Network. The Wicked Project, and that's our shorthand name for it, and it's the full title is The Wicked Problem. And having listened to 2 afternoons of most extraordinary talks, which I've learned so much, I understand even better why we called it The Wicked Problem, because the complexity and the layers from global, to local, the industrial context, the economic context, the justice, all those issues. It's such a multi-layered, complex problem, bringing together so many different disciplines to find a solution. That, I mean, clearly working together in these ways is the challenge and the thing that we need to do. And, we've talked very much about the global perspective. Our project goes down to country level. And so we have research teams in this project in 7 countries across East Africa and the Caribbean, and Jamaica in the Caribbean. It's funded by UK Research and Innovation, by the Global Challenges Research Fund, which focuses funding particularly on developing countries, which is where our focus is. And Henrique was just mentioning about the level of interest and activity from developing countries, and we have found it is extraordinary. Much of the debate is at global level, but you go down to the country level, and here is the activity. Here is what is actually underpinning this global debate that is occurring. Our particular project, the wicked problem of plastics pollution and the discourse surrounding its governance, is about it brings together 2 different disciplines, as wicked problems do. They are multidisciplinary, and it brings together governance, so we have lawyers on the team. It brings together communication experts, so we have those on the teams as well. And I have popped a website address in the chat box, and you can find all the 7 teams and the members of those teams who've contributed to this work there. It is work in progress. It's a 2-year project, and we're just over halfway through. So I can report to you where we are today, and in another year's time, come back, I hope, on another occasion and tell you where we've got to. But the objectives of the project are to work with national partners, to build the network of national partners, so as to improve the governance of plastic pollution, and to identify best practices on communication strategies and governance structures. So essentially, we're looking at the message, the story that's being told about plastics, and how that impacts on governance, how that can influence the law, both in terms of policy, legislation, regulation, and the enforcement of that. So our activities have been mapping, first of all, the national stakeholders across those 7 countries, using methodology to identify the most influential stakeholders, and then to look at their communication strategies. What is the story that they're telling, and how has that story affected the country's governance? In my own country, the UK, we've got a very active environmentalist, David Attenborough, who produced a rather amazing series called Blue Planet. And there was just a few minutes in that series about plastics pollution. And that impacted on the way that our government legislated on single-use plastics. So, the impact of communications and such strategies can be huge, and it's what we've focused on particularly in this project. And then we've analysed the governance frameworks relating to single-use plastics in those 7 countries, and we are working on that at the moment, identifying opportunities for improvement. We've so far we are running national roundtables. So we're running 7 national roundtables in all, and we've held the first one so far. So we've had the Kenyan national roundtable. And so I present to you some of the results that the Kenyan research team came up with particularly. And you will find their policy brief on the media pages on our website. So much more detail there about it. I'm picking out sort of highlight issues. And, they diagnosed the problem that, there are advanced legal frameworks. And I think this is something I find over and over again when I look in other countries' legal frameworks around different issues. And here, looking at single-use plastics, that there are laws. In fact, as Nick Aguge mentioned yesterday, 34 African countries have laws, and they've had them in place for some time, banning single-use plastics, rather ahead of much of the rest of the world. So you do have legal frameworks there. It's not, in many respects, the lack of law that's the problem. It is the lack of implementation, and they identify cultural adherence, our behavior, our desire to do things in a certain way, and the enforcement of the law is a key problem. As part of the activities, the research teams, having identified key stakeholders in plastics pollution, we asked them to select 2 or 3 different case studies to analyse the messages that those stakeholders were giving and how they'd influenced governance structures. And the Kenyan team identified, individuals as one mechanism for campaigns that can change the way that the law operates, and then the role of international NGOs. They picked out 2 here using those, research methodology to do so. So I just sort of give you a sample of those 2. One was James Wakibia, very driven environmental activist. He came and spoke at the national roundtable that we held, his approach is based on a passion. It is a commitment that the man has, and he's used a variety of techniques to tell his story. He's a photojournalist, so he used that as a mechanism. Many other different ways. There's a picture here of the boat, the flip-floppy project with the boat made from recycled plastic and so on. So some very powerful communication strategies being used there. And he's credited with inspiring Kenya's plastic ban a few years back. Now, of course, he's concerned about the enforcement of that. And then the second successful case that Kenya diagnosed, the case study they looked at, and quite a different one. I think this is interesting because you go from an activist to an association of manufacturers, the private sector. So an NGO that brings together, that represents the manufacturers associations in Kenya, has its own advocacy unit, produced the Kenya Action Plan for Plastics, has a powerful influence, and of course talks directly to its base, the manufacturing base. So critically important in terms of its commitment. And they too came and spoke at our roundtable as to how they're working in this particular sector. Coming up is the Malawi National Roundtable, and a very different story there that they will tell us about. We have yet to have there, so you still have an opportunity to attend their roundtable. And a very interesting story there. 20.
I'm sorry, Rosalind, we're going to have to start to wrap up. I'm sorry, just so you have time for Kimberley as well.
No problem, no problem. We have recommendations from Kenya as to how to move towards the future, looking for networks of ambassadors, and Jamaica is an interesting example of that. Working on local messaging, how we give that message out, and how we use symbols to do that. Come to the national roundtables, please. We've got 7 in all. The Kenya one is online, so you can watch that one. And they are very valuable. You will hear the detail of the results from our research teams in those roundtables over the next 2-3 months. And that's me done. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. You were finishing up anyway. I'm sorry for rushing you. I have to say, just fascinating case study from Kenya there. And I know it's a great syncing up now with Kimberley, who's been doing work on Ghana specifically, but I really commend you for the work at the national level as well, to try and understand what the dynamics are there, both on the civil society side and the industry side nationally as well. So Kimberley, I turn now to you.
Great, thank you so much, and very much echo there's been really interesting listening to those presentations by my fellow panelists. So I'm going to share a little bit some ideas on how trade policy can help Ghana address plastic pollution. And this comes from a research paper that we recently launched, the World Economic Forum, together with our Global Plastics Action Partnership Initiative. So we launched this paper recently, and it can be found on the GPAP website. I will put the link in the chat shortly. We're very grateful for the support of the UK government that helped to fund the research. And the goal was really to go from a global perspective. So we know that how many governments at the WTO and elsewhere are thinking about how trade policy can help address plastic pollution, but we wanted to go from that global discussion and sharing of ideas really down to a very granular local perspective and see what it would mean for a country to leverage their trade policy for their specific plastic action initiatives. So before I go into some of the ideas on trade policy, let me just give you the context on plastic pollution in Ghana. Like many others, Ghana is a fast-growing economy with a significant and burgeoning waste problem that the government is very keen to address. Ghana's imported plastic volume grew 25% between 2015 and 2019, totaling around 1.9 million tons. So a lot of plastic coming into the country. These are mainly in polymer resins, the primary input material for plastic production, and a lot of that is going to plastic packaging, plastic furniture, and so on and so forth. There are around 120 companies that are converting these polymer resins into those inputs for finished products. It's worth noting that single-use plastics manufacturing is really predominant. So there isn't a lot of recycled plastic production that's going on, and there isn't so much thinking about how to integrate recycled materials into finished products at the moment. Why has there been such a surge in single-use packaging over the last few years in the country? I think this picks up on what other panelists said, is that actually plastic serves a really valuable is a really valuable resource when you're thinking about addressing issues like access to drinking water. Ghana has quite a poor municipal water supply, and that's created a huge demand for miniaturized plastic sachets for powdered water and other forms of drinking water. So then just thinking about, so that's sort of the upstream, the imports for the polymer resins, and then the midstream, the conversion. Thinking about downstream, this is really characterized in Ghana by informal operations. In the Greater Accra region alone, there's around 5,000 informal collectors of plastic waste. There's only a few licensed waste collection firms, but that's something the government is really looking to change, to encourage private sector participation to boost capacity. So even though there's a huge number, the next statistics that I'll share will demonstrate that there's actually quite little collection and recycling happening. So the recycling rate in Ghana for plastics overall is around 10%, and it's lower in some types than others. And probably around 1.2 million tons of plastic waste has accumulated in Ghana's dump sites and landfills over recent years, so a huge number. Just to categorize some of the challenges around this collection and recycling piece, and also very conscious that of course it is the 3 R's, so it's not just recycling, there is also a reduce and a reuse element. But on the recycling piece, major areas that the work that our GPAP has been doing in the country around that are really holding back this material recovery is absence of sorting bins, collectors are underfunded and poorly equipped. There's an absence of an extended producer responsibility scheme, and a lack of a scaled recycling that translates into low offtake and weak prices, so poor earnings for collectors. So this is really creating a bit of a vicious circle, at least for that pillar of recycling. I'm conscious, and our report goes into a few of the other elements too of what we need to do to address plastic pollution, but there I was just talking about the recycling pieces. So then the report puts forward a few ideas on a few examples on the domestic policy front of what can be done to improve this landscape, but it really just skims those because that's the work that's being done through GPAP and is ongoing in the country in dialogue with officials. But the reason why we skimmed over them was to then layer on top of that a few options for a proactive trade policy approach for Ghana to consider. So we categorize these into 4 areas. The first is controlling plastic waste trade. So Ghana, like many other countries, will need to strengthen the controls to restrict imports of non-recyclable and hazardous plastic waste, also in line with the Basel Convention plastic waste amendments that are enforced from January of this year. It'll be important to develop adequate customs capacity. And so there's probably an opportunity for the international community to explore the links between aid for trade programs, and environmental initiatives designed to support Basel implementation. Of course, there are challenges right now at the HS level. The 6-digit HS classification for custom codes do not differentiate products on their potential hazard for recyclability. That is something that the Basel Secretariat and WCO are working on. Countries like Ghana could amend and take a more strategic approach by amending the national 8-digit or 10-digit HS schedules. Ghana is part of ECOWAS, so they would need to do that at a regional level. And probably they would only want to do that if they were really serious about developing and becoming a regional hub for a recycling center, because you don't want to import. Why would you do that if you didn't actually have the capacity to take the plastic waste and recycle it? But there are opportunities if you were able to do that to then become a bit of a regional hub, and that could generate jobs. So something for Ghana to consider, but step by step, I think. Secondly, our second bucket was facilitate the import of relevant goods. So regardless of which strategy Ghana chooses to take, whether it wants to become a recycling hub or not, it will need to import certain environmental goods that will accelerate its progress towards a more circular economy. That includes things like plastic alternatives, as well as recycling machinery, technologies and chemicals and used in recycling processes and so on. Thirdly, there's the third bucket is attracting investment and services. So we estimated that around 3 billion in capital expenditure would be needed in Ghana over the next 20 years to establish the necessary plastic waste management infrastructure to deal with the growing waste that's occurring. And that even assumes the reduce and the recycling. So clearly there's a need to bring in investment to scale up services in this area. And so again, that's something that Ghana can use its trade agreements to facilitate investment via services commitments, but also looking at specific investment facilitation measures, regulatory coherence, transparency around regulatory requirements, and so on and so forth. And finally, our fourth bucket was thinking about the export markets. So partly if you're encouraging your industry to move to alternatives or use recycled plastics, then there's also the need to think about, will that be compatible and compliant with a market that they may be seeking abroad? There are differences in design and implementation of standards emerging around recycled plastic or around packaging, full stop. Certain markets, such as the EU, now have quite strict rules on plastic packaging overall. And while that's really positive, there's the need to take that into account and build up the capacity, help some of these SMEs transition and find those alternative materials that they can still trade, and the good still ends up on the market in a good condition. So there again, we think there's a real opportunity for the international community to lean in and to avoid the silos between environment and trade capacity building programs. So I'll wrap up now, Caroline, but going forward, the forum is looking to replicate this study in other GPAP economies. So we have the overall network of GPAP, and then in each country, we have a national plastic action platform that's developed that brings together the different cross-cutting actors. And we have a target of 25 emerging, running these MPAPs in 25 emerging economies by 2025. So my colleagues have their work cut out for them. And what we want to do is layer a trade element in as many of these economies as possible, and also be able to then implement or start having best practice sharing between them. The UK government has already committed seed funding to this trade track within GPAP, and we hope that other partners can join and help us scale to achieve this vision. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kimberley. And I was really happy that you made the link back from the circular economy work back to some of the trade policy interventions that might be useful as well. I'm going to quickly, we have 6 minutes remaining, so I think the best thing to do is simply to turn the floor back to each of you. In fact, to tell us what you found most fascinating about the presentations of others and how it would help our thinking on moving forward on these issues. Because we've had quite a rich exchange of practical lessons especially from developing countries, which I feel like we should have had earlier in the panel. So I'm going to do that. I would also note that there's a question here which I think is interesting from one of the people in the audience, saying that one of the challenges I guess it's in manufacturing and packaging plants, is that the machinery is not customized to use plastic packaging most efficiently. So they say tons of flexible plastic packaging is used because people don't customize their machines properly. And I was thinking then, Henrique, it really goes down to this sense that there's so many levels at which we need to just try and improve efficiency in the system. I mean, we all receive, excess packaging with our work and with the products that we buy. And there seems to be a need to really look at sort of a cross-cutting way about how those sorts of challenges can be fixed. But enough from me. What I'll do is I'll turn back to everyone in the order that they spoke. So then I will start first with Patrick, just for a final sort of 1 minute wrapping up comment.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, this was fascinating presentations. I want to comment on Rosalind's project. Which is great, and it reminded me that we were involved in something similar, funded by the UK under the GCF, the Global Challenges Research Fund, on digital innovations to reduce plastic pollution in Africa. And unfortunately, the project was stopped after the first year because of the UK's cut to the aid budget, which is a sad example of how a topic which should actually gain an importance in international development cooperation is basically stopped after the initial period. We hope there will be other funding opportunities coming up to restart the work that we've done. There's possibly also synergies, I think, between our projects, and it's also these synergies that Henrique mentioned that we should explore in terms of, I was thinking especially about our messages and our recommendations on policies. So I think there's need for more coordination between the different UN organizations working on plastics pollution, and it will come down to implementation of policies on national and local levels to tackle this pollution problem, I think. And yeah, lots of work for us ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick. So Mahesh and Henrique, super quick.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for the great presentations. One of the points I thought, which was sort of an interesting strand, more like a question which I would like to maybe sort of put out to the audience and to the panelists is, when you're looking at investment needs of these developing countries, how do you bridge the gap between global and local? Because on one hand, you need these technologies and investments to respond to sort of the local needs and priorities and adapt to local conditions, like the informal sector and so on. But on the other hand, you also need to have that global standard for environmentally sound management, which is essential for meeting prerequisites of conventions like the Basel Convention. So in terms of financing options out there, how is that balance going to be struck between localizing it and making sure that it meets a minimum threshold of acceptability at the global level? Thank you.
Thank you, Mahesh. We won't have time to answer the question, but we're going to take it as an important framing issue going forward. Henrique.
I will stand on the shoulders of giants here. So Kimberley, what you said on that Ghana managing its current plastic waste streams, costing billions of dollars, it sounds like a losing fight. So it remits me to what Patrick said on the focus, the importance to focus on redesign instead of recycling. So we should not only look at the end of the life of what we already have there, we should think the other up the midstream mainly. And then what Mahesh said on the plastics, alternatives to plastics, the material alternatives require careful analysis. They change a lot depending on the country. So what is competitive in one is not in the other. So this requires more studies and data so that the national authorities can make wise decisions. And also the private sector is willing to engage in this. So we need to funnel the funds wisely to de-risk their attempts.
Great, Rosalind.
I confess I wasn't convinced we needed a treaty. I now am, I learned from the conference, and I learned that we do need a global treaty. We mustn't neglect, though, the key problem. I work mostly at national level, not at international level. And the key problem I see is lack of enforcement, not lack of law. The global treaty is essential to make people work together, to bring the issues out, you know, to develop a common understanding, standardization, and the rest of it. But we need to pay equal attention to the problems of enforcement at national level.
Great. Thank you very much, Rosalind. I think also just capacity at the national level, and that goes to these investment issues and so on. Kimberley.
Thanks. I wish I could just repeat what Rosalind said. I thought that was fantastic. So +1 from my side. Then I will also say I really found presentation by Mahesh and Henrique really interesting, because I fully agree with you, Henrique. There is this need to also change the system and move to the alternatives. I find when thinking about trade policy, seems like it's easier for us to focus on the recycled piece, and the alternatives, there are so many different ones, and it also creates questions of challenges and standards. So I think there's a lot more thinking and engagement from different actors with different expertise to be able to figure out that piece of the puzzle, but it's really needed because we need the global market to send the right signals, and it might not be at the moment, or rather global policy to send the right signals. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, I'm just going to make one last substantive point, which is just, I really take your, I mean, I think something that's come out for me on this is just the importance of redesigning and improved manufacturing. There's a certain amount of plastic that is going to continue to be produced, and developing countries want to also be part of that pie as part of their own economic diversification strategies and something. So I think the substitutes line is super important, but anything we can do to also support countries to produce in a cleaner, greener, more reusable, more recyclable way is really, really important. That's probably something we haven't emphasized enough as a community or so on to date. So really interested in further work on that. So all in all, that brings us to the end of this session. So I'd like to thank each of you for your participation, and hopefully it sparked new ideas and potential collaborations among you. I'd also like to take the moment to thank actually all of our team behind the scenes, because this is the final session of our conference. So I really would love to thank, well, firstly, our collaborators, UNCTAD, and also to CL, the Geneva Trade Platform, Geneva Environment Network, and UNEP's Trade and Environment Hub for supporting this conference today, and also our financial supporters, which is the Swiss Network of International Studies. But mostly I'd like to thank my colleagues, Louisa, Dipashri, Juanita, and Michael, who really did all of the heavy lifting behind the scenes. And Diana and I, as co-hosts, are tremendously grateful to them for their support. So thank you all again, and we look forward to being in touch. All of this will be online, so you can go back and see all the sessions, and we'll try and produce some kind of summary in the coming weeks. So thank you very much. With that, we're all done.